If you've ever watched a popular crime show, you're probably somewhat familiar with this storyline. A team of super cool FBI agents find out about a murder, travel to the crime scene, examine the evidence for hours and hours and hours and hours, and hey, what's that over there? They find a partial fingerprint on the side of a bedroom coffee table, find a match within their DNA database, and arrest the criminal. Humanity is saved. Bad guys go to jail, good guys go back home. All's well that ends well. But what happens when the person that they just proved to be a horrible, disgusting murderer turns out to be innocent? Yet somehow the evidence says otherwise. Which do we believe? The people or the science? Forensic science may be responsible for this issue, known to include forms of pattern evidence, including shoe print comparisons, bite mark analysis, handwriting comparisons, microscopic hair analysis, and others. This key set of evidence is often what leads to the ultimate verdict, guilty or not guilty. Because if actual science is presented to a jury by a credible forensic expert, no one would question its reliability. But the truth is, forensic science is so far from being an exact science, yet it's continued to be treated like one. And this is a major issue. According to the Innocence Project, it is estimated that 1% of the total US prison population are wrongfully convicted. That's 20,000 people. 20,000 lives changed. 20,000 families broken. 20,000 futures shattered. Time and time again, certain forensic science practices have been proven to be unreliable, inconsistent, and responsible for over 50% of convictions later overturned by the use of proper DNA evidence. Our system has failed far too many innocent and vulnerable people. People like Alfred Swinton. Alfred Swinton served 18 years of a 60-year sentence. He was convicted for murdering 5 young women, found guilty after Dr. Gus Caruslas, the chief forensic odontologist of the Connecticut State Police Forensic Science Laboratory, testified that bite mark analysis was an exact science. Dr. Caruslas said that he compared the bite marks he found on the body to Swinton's teeth and determined to an absolute medical certainty that Swinton's teeth made the marks. Yet upon further investigation, forensic dentist Neil Reisner testified that his examination found absolutely no correlation between Swinton's teeth and the marks. So how could such an exact science prove to be so inexact and have completely conflicting analyses? The truth is, the forensic science community had long rejected bite mark analysis as a credible forensic method, calling it junk science. And yet, the evidence was still used, and Alfred Swinton was still convicted. An outdated practice put a man in prison for 18 years. 18 years of Alfred Swinton's life was taken away, stolen, never to be returned. He was an innocent man, and yet the police believed him to be a disgusting, psychopathic serial killer. And yet Alfred Swinton is so far from being the only one. I want you all to take just 1 second to take a step back and really reflect. Imagine having your entire life ripped to shreds for something you know you didn't do. But you also know that there's nothing you can say or do to prove it. That's exactly what happened to Dale Johnston. At the age of 52, Dale Johnston was convicted for 2 counts of aggravated murder and sentenced to die in the electric chair. His stepdaughter and her fiance had been found mutilated, their torsos disposed of in Hocking River, their heads and limbs found buried in a cornfield. And what was the main piece of evidence brought forth by the prosecution for this horrific crime? A muddy shoe print. Dale Johnston spent 11 years on death row over a muddy shoe print. A muddy shoe print that, according to the forensic expert that analyzed it, could have made the same impression as one of Johnston's boots. Could have. Could have. Dale Johnston was sentenced to die based on evidence that could have been true. Evidence that is derived from a process that is inaccurate, inconclusive, and according to the National Academy of Sciences, not based on any actual scientific studies. Dale Johnston was innocent, but somehow he still paid the price. In 2008, Chester McKnight confessed to the crimes. But for Dale Johnston, the confession came too late. By the time Chester McKnight finally uttered those words, Dale Johnston had already been convicted and sentenced to death. His house had already been burnt to the ground by his neighbors who thought him a murderer. His wife had already left him, and his only remaining daughter had already been placed in foster care. Dale Johnston lost everything, all over a muddy shoe print and faulty science. A recent study found that evidence is misapplied in 22% of all cases in which that evidence was critical in the trial. These cases are not anomalies, but rather consequences of a flawed system that accepts faulty science and the systemic issues that come with it. And that is why I am proposing to Congress my 3-step legislative plan. Step 1, increase funding. From 2009 to 2018, less than 0.03% of all the total research funding on the national level was devoted to forensic science, and less than 0.003% on foundational research. With increased funding for research, the fundamental sciences underlying forensic science practices can be strengthened and developed for reliable, transparent, and reproducible criminal procedures. Step 2, develop rigorous national standards. The National Institute of Standards and Technology must be established in every single state, providing an overlying forensic science commission that makes sure that prosecutors do not rely on invalid forensic techniques. By increasing the validity and quality of forensic science practices, we can help ensure that science is being applied in the most accurate and appropriate ways. And step 3, increase partnerships between the Federal Department of Forensic Sciences and initiatives that have established a record of supporting post-conviction relief, such as the Innocence Project. We must begin to review every single case in which unsound science may have contributed to a conviction. Our system has failed too often, and it's imperative that we free the innocent that are entitled to their relief. We must at least try to right our wrongs. Growing up, I loved watching crime shows. I found the investigators so admirable and even sought becoming an FBI agent as my lifelong dream. Because what better way is there to defeat all of the evils in the world? I now know that we too have become plagued with evil. We send tens of thousands of innocent people to prison every single year and don't even bat an eye. We continue to rely on unreliable practices, even though their credibility has been shattered. We ruin lives, we break families, we shatter futures. Only our immediate action can change that. Alfred Swinton was innocent. Dale Johnston was innocent. So many more are innocent. But let me ask you, how many more innocent people have to lose faith in humanity for humanity to finally be restored? I hope your answer is the same as mine. No more. Because I think we can all agree that 20,000 people sitting in prison right now for crimes that they did not commit is simply 20,000 too many. Thank you.
The first time I was asked if I was taking heroin was in the Ralph's ice cream aisle. I was in the 7th grade and sporting the classic Hot Topic angsty tee, low-rise skinny jeans, and an aggressive side part. Surprisingly, I wasn't well versed with the ins and outs of heroin use at the ripe old age of 12. I thought that maybe being mistaken as a drug addict was just something that happened once you reached middle school. And while not everyone is as bold as Linda, the Ralph's clerk, I have gotten my fair share of glares and whispers. People have gotten close to passing out when I've whipped out a syringe. However, it's not heroin I'm shooting into my veins. It's something much sweeter and way more expensive. Insulin. That's right. I have type 1 diabetes. Type 1, T1D, the reason I give myself a minimum of 4 shots a day to stay alive. When I had a virus, my immune system accidentally attacked an entire organ, my pancreas, instead of just the bug. Whoops. However, insulin, the thing I use to keep myself alive, cost more money than the entire shelf of ice cream at Ralph's. And that's the problem. Insulin prices have soared, leaving many type 1 diabetics having to choose whether to eat or take their medication. In fact, in 2018, the National Health Institute reported that the price of insulin has skyrocketed to $450 a month for type 1 diabetics. However, to understand insulin prices, we must examine the larger pharmaceutical price crisis. So today, let's enter the store to discuss the causes behind America's pharmaceutical prices. Next, we'll wander the aisles to see the devastating effects, before finally proceeding to check out some life-saving legislation. To begin, we all, including Linda from Ralph's, need to understand the causes behind America's pharmaceutical prices. First, America's pharmaceutical prices are so high because our fractured insurance system allows Big Pharma to take the lead. Compare our failing system to England's thriving one. Picture the English pharmaceutical system like a giant Costco. Because Costco is so big, it has the power to negotiate low prices through bulk buying. Just like Costco, Vox explains that the English pharmaceutical system negotiates low prices through setting price caps for each of its drugs. However, Vox furthers that America has drug companies haggle separately with private insurers, allowing Big Pharma to take the lead. This gives pharmaceuticals the power to make huge amounts of money off of the American people. The CDC found that when compared to other countries, America's pharmaceuticals range from 0.6 to 67 times more expensive for the same drug. It's time to ask ourselves, who are America's pharmaceutical prices benefiting? I will give you a hint. Not us. Everyone is a culprit of our second cause, supporting Big Pharma, because we have to. I can choose not to buy trail mix from a gas station with jacked up prices, but I can't just opt out of buying insulin. Because of this, I comprise the first tier of people who perpetuate high drug prices. Our second tier is the pharmaceutical manufacturers themselves. These companies slightly tweak formulas every time their patent is about to expire to prevent a generic and cheaper option from being produced. Our final tier is ALEC, or the American Legislative Executive Council, and they propose model bills for our government officials. Some of its members include pharmaceutical companies. So many of our government officials aren't working to lower our drug prices because their campaigns and the bills they introduce are funded by companies who have a personal investment in maintaining high drug prices. It's time to stop the corruption and start focusing on the lives at stake. In 1923, the patent for insulin sold for a mere $1. However, now that same insulin I use to inject myself with costs an average of $1,500 out of pocket every year. This is simply not affordable for the vast majority of Americans. It's time to wander the aisles to see the devastating effects of America's pharmaceutical price crisis. First, America's pharmaceutical prices most directly impact the lower class and people of color. The National Health Institute found that marginalized racial groups are up to 2 times more likely than whites to have a major chronic illness. Moreover, Kaiser Health reported that while only 8% of white Americans are uninsured, the number increases to 13.4% for people of color. Pharmaceutical prices are simultaneously impacting people who are more likely to need treatment while being less likely to afford it. Second, America's pharmaceutical prices encourage drug rationing. While pharmaceuticals were swimming in over $40 billion of profits within the last year, CNBC reports that 44% of Americans did not take at least one medically necessary drug because of cost. And Harvard Health explains to us the detrimental effects of drug rationing, saying that unnecessary complications from underuse can lead to an increased medical cost if hospitalization or other treatments are necessary. Pharmaceuticals are either making their money off of their original prescription or the medication needed to treat someone who has attempted to ration it. They win even when we lose. However, there is often only so much our doctors can do to attempt to reverse the effects of drug rationing. The CDC reports an average of 125,000 deaths every year due to medication non-adherence alone. For type 1 diabetics, these are horrific rates. From Alex Smith to Jada Renee Lewis, there is a mounting death toll of type 1 diabetics who have attempted to ration insulin. It's hard to comprehend the devastation when you don't have a personal relationship, but to me, these are terrifying numbers. For many type 1 diabetics, including myself, we have no way to guarantee that we will be able to afford insulin once we age out of our parents' insurance. We have seen the carnage from today's pharmaceutical prices. Now is not the time for timid steps. That's why I propose a 3-step legislative plan to address the pharmaceutical price crisis. First, in order for a drug price reform to succeed, we must address the pharmaceutical lobbying industry. We must properly register all lobbyists, make it illegal to lobby for a foreign government, political party, or private corporation, and ban lobbyists from becoming government officials. That's why I propose to pass Senator Elizabeth Warren's plan from her presidential campaign, which does exactly that. Passing these legislations will be a step to fighting pharmaceuticals on the ground level. Next, with 17.8% of Americans being covered under Medicare, we must give more power to Medicare. That's why I propose to pass the Medicare Price Negotiation Act of 2019, co-sponsored by 37 congresspeople, which will give Medicare the ability to negotiate lower drug prices. Finally, to give power to the American patient, I advocate to allow American patients to import drugs from Canada. With Senator Bernie Sanders' Safe and Affordable Prescription Medication Importation Act of 2019 garnering support from both sides of the aisles, this is a bipartisan effort. This effort will begin to give the American patients more options when filling their prescriptions, forcing American pharmaceuticals, including insulin manufacturers, to lower their prices. In fact, the Congressional Budget Office found that Senator Bernie Sanders' plan will save the U.S. federal government over $7 billion. In the first presidential debate of 2020, former President Donald Trump said that insulin was so cheap, it's just like water. However, with companies making billions off of a drug so expensive that people are dying from their attempts to ration it, insulin is the farthest thing away from water. Today we talked about how, through reforming the lobbying industry and giving more power to the American patient and Medicare, we can start to make a dent in America's pharmaceutical price crisis. It's time to stop making excuses for why things are the way they are and start making change that could potentially save millions. Thank you.
David Weiss doesn't want to be a flat earther. He doesn't want the ridicule. He doesn't want the hassle. And yet, ever since he tried and failed to find proof of the Earth's curve about 4 years ago, he's believed with an evident passion that our planet is both stationary and flat. Recently, he attended the 3rd annual Flat Earth International Conference, where he joined 600 other flat earthies in discussing his suspicions of naughty NASA and manipulative modern-day scary science. It was one of the biggest events of the year. Organizers told CNN that flat Earth events were beginning to fill the calendar year-round. And according to a recent survey conducted by YouGov, only 81% of millennials believe that the Earth is round, and the other 19% got that same grade percentage in their geology class. But though these numbers may seem laughable right now, they're indicative of something far more insidious: disinformation campaigns that have only grown in size and stature across our most powerful platforms. And in today's society, these campaigns are threatening much more than our understanding of the Earth's curvature. So first, let's understand how our modern society has evolved to consume disinformation. Then, let's investigate the current forces allowing disinformation to thrive on our most powerful platforms. And finally, let's learn how we can regulate the campaigns that have very literally eroded our democracy in the past decade. We've all seen the devastating impacts of disinformation. Those, unfortunately, aren't new. Whether we're talking about the rampant anti-mask campaign that's already taken the lives of 500,000 and counting, or the recent insurrection at the US Capitol, disinformation has been the silent fuel to it all. But what exactly makes it so pervasive? Is it the content itself, or how it's presented online? Well, according to the Pew Research Center in 2017, the fake news ecosystem preys on some of our deepest human instincts. For example, our survival instinct. Now, I know what you're thinking. It sounds strange that our survival instinct can push many to reject a life-saving vaccine, for example. But as long as we look for solidarity with our peers, manipulative actors online can create what are known as echo chambers, places where many can be repeatedly reassured that their deepest convictions are 100% correct. And this positive feedback loop only brings in more and more who feel as if they've been isolated by the mainstream. You see, it's far easier for many to seek out only the rhetoric that they already believe, a phenomenon you might know as confirmation bias. Now, that's existed forever. The problem is when our news platforms adapt to fit that phenomenon. So, we already know that there is likely very little overlap between viewers of Fox News and viewers of CNN. But there is also very little overlap between the actual news presented by both sources. In December, when CNN was devoting most of its airtime to covering the alarming rise of COVID-19 across the country, Fox News instead focused on the Hunter Biden scandal. These two stories received virtually no coverage on the opposing platforms. And social media has taken this exact phenomenon and absolutely exploded it. You see, when you use like a platform like Facebook that is geared at anticipating your interests, you'll get a set of news articles and posts just for you, regardless of whether they're inaccurate, misleading, or at worst, completely distracting from the real problems our world is facing. This personalization of news is destroying our understanding of reality itself. But okay, you might be thinking, fine, if the quality of the information isn't going to improve in our platforms, is there any way to just get it off? Well, that's not quite as simple either. And we only have to look to our political pundits as to why. the American Bar Association claims that for a society that cares about freedom of speech, it is time for the First Amendment to cover the powerful private entities that have ushered in our era of mass communication, regardless of the actual content of that communication. In other words, even those spreading lies and harmful conspiracy theories online through these entities are protected under the First Amendment. And even after this type of speech incited the only violent transition of power we've had for hundreds of years, Tucker Carlson's Fox News show compared the Trump ban and other big tech crackdowns to Germans with the Jews behind the wall. He called it the digital ghetto, claiming that the First Amendment had been totally abandoned. Even though there is no free speech protection of lawlessness and violence. Even though there is no free speech argument that guarantees anyone the right to express their views on any specific platform. But while that may be an extreme example, the bans of Donald Trump across social media did raise an important concern. Because even if we figure out what speech shouldn't be tolerated online, who gets to be the arbiter of truth in our society? Is it Jack Dorsey, CEO of Twitter, an unelected billionaire who now has the unilateral decision to halt speech online? Is it Mark Zuckerberg, who's let disinformation run rampant across Facebook for its entire existence just to make a buck? Recently, Apple and Google deplatformed Parler, one of the most popular conservative social networks, but should they have been the ones to police our digital public squares? Or should it have been solely up to our government, of which some leaders are currently defending the violence of a few months ago, whose leaders will always have the power to incite more? Well, as it turns out, none of those are good answers, because the solution has to be as multifaceted as the problem itself. The first step is in establishing a digital Bill of Rights within our Communications Decency Act, something that clearly differentiates between free speech and the algorithms that make hate content and other blatantly false information go viral. This would also require companies to transparently report how they moderate such content, so no one can claim that the First Amendment is being abandoned without reason. Next, we must provide more education about our scientific and technological advancements, to explain controversial issues like why a 95% success rate for our vaccines becomes a green light. And finally, the only long-term solution we have is to change the algorithms that create echo chambers everywhere we turn. In the often few minutes we have to look at news every day, our phones and social media accounts bombard us with the articles and the posts they gather we want to see. And that is the most dangerous part of it all. When our news becomes personalized, we see a different reality than everyone else. And it is only by reversing that trend that we can break the walls disinformation has constructed among us. Because it may not seem that problematic that David Weiss believes the earth is flat. But it is not okay when anti-vaxxers who believe that vaccines are solely toxic never hear from our world's brightest scientists of the rigorous safety tests to ensure they're not. It is not okay when climate change deniers, who believe that the Earth's climate has always been changing, never see a single post that 17 of the 18 warmest years on record have all taken place since 2001. And it is not okay when the person you voted for loses and you can't find a single piece of information on your social media accounts as to why. Save for an explore page screaming, "Storm the Capitol." David Weiss needs to see that the earth may be round and all of the evidence as to why. And that only happens when we restore the promise of the internet. When we foster accuracy and accountability on our most powerful platform, our society can finally begin to move forward. Thank you.
We've been quarantined for a year, and we're finally starting to get the vaccine. But there's just one tiny little problem. I hate shots. And before you all call me a wuss, okay, fine, maybe I am. I'm 16 years old and I still cry every time I get my flu shot. And the only thing that makes it better is the Scooby-Doo Band-Aids they give me after. So this year, I put on my big girl pants and went to get my flu shot. And as I was looking away from the needle for what felt like an eternity, I noticed something that I'd never thought about before. For the first time ever, my doctor was a woman of color. And maybe that isn't so surprising. If so, you've been fortunate to experience some of the limited diversity in America's medical industry. Because as much as we'd like to think that this is the norm, it is in fact the exception. Because America's medical workforce fails to represent our diversity as a nation. According to the Association of American Medical Colleges, among doctors in the United States, more than half identify as white, whereas only 17% identify as Asian, 6% as Latinx, and only 5% as Black. And you may wonder, does it matter? A doctor's a doctor. But a University of Maryland study exposes the implicit biases in medicine, stating that people of color, the LGBTQ community, and women are less likely to be believed by their doctors and are more likely to suffer. So to unmask the answer to this problem, we must first diagnose the causes behind this doctor dilemma, examine the effects of this unhealthy disparity, and finally, prescribe the legislation necessary for a long-term solution. Disparities in healthcare go back over decades. In 1951, Henrietta Lacks, an African-American woman, went to the Johns Hopkins Hospital with concerns of pain. She wasn't taken seriously by her doctors, treated in segregated wards, and died from a lack of proper care. And besides the fact that they stole her cells like the medical version of Christopher Columbus and profited millions of dollars off of the literal body of a Black woman, Henrietta Lacks' story is just one of many. And considering the medical industry's repeated efforts to cover up the truth, it's a miracle we even know about it. And so you might be thinking that things are definitely better now. Yet the problem continues to grow. Although institutional bias is less explicit, medical interactions between marginalized patients and their doctors are less than ideal. In the medical field, women are misdiagnosed 50% more, and their ailments are more likely to be dismissed, ignored, and left untreated because their symptoms don't conform to those of men. Gynecologist Dr. Colleen Arnold explains that if a woman appears stoic and she's not showing her pain, then she's not believed. But if she does show her pain, now she's overly emotional, exaggerating her pain, and still isn't believed. And how can we expect equality in medical care when this continues to happen? Dr. Damon Tweedy, psychiatry professor at Duke University and author of Black Man in a White Coat, talks about the prejudice and microaggressions that people of color face when seeking treatment. He explains one instance where a Black patient named Gary came in with chest pain. Nurses prescribed blood pressure meds and other drugs almost immediately. But Gary refused. He told the nurses that he wanted to first fix his diet and exercise habits. But because he said no, the nurses jumped to the conclusion that he was being outright difficult. One even claimed that he was mentally ill because he wanted to focus on bettering himself as opposed to taking prescribed medication. And that's a pill no one should be forced to swallow. The consistent pattern of nurses and doctors mistreating and misidentifying their patients is a product of the system that produces them. And this is why representation matters, because patients across America deserve access to quality medical services and to trust that the professionals who take care of them have their best interests in mind, because the effects are severe. For starters, we're not having discussions on the impact of racism and discrimination on health. And as a result, these measures simply become a diagnostic shortcut. Just this past month, Arkansas state legislators passed a bill denying gender-affirming healthcare to transgender youth. By stating that doctors can now choose to refuse to treat certain patients, this bill is sending a dangerous message to LGBTQ communities across America that they are less deserving of healthcare. And how can we allow those who do not understand the struggles of targeted communities to make decisions that impact their lives? Simply put, we need doctors who make the effort to connect with marginalized patients, doctors who will hear their concerns, relate to their symptoms, and correctly diagnose them. And it's worked in the past. A study conducted by the American Economic Association found that over 34% of Black patients receive better care when they see Black doctors. And the reason? Empathy and trust. This isn't a simple problem, but one with far deeper roots. According to the Harvard Business Review, hospitals in marginalized communities are understaffed and under-resourced, resulting in Black doctors being twice as likely to contract COVID-19 compared to their white counterparts. And this disparity due to the lack of support is unacceptable. Thus, I propose CARE, the following 4-part legislation to be implemented by the US Department of Education, in hopes of investing in the communities who may be suffering the most. Section 1, curriculum. Revise curriculum from the bottom up, because as advocacy groups like White Coats for Black Lives are doing, we must press schools to incorporate discussions on cultural competency when teaching life sciences, because America's dark past cannot be ignored when learning about the present. Section 2, access. Institutional barriers hold a lot of eager students back from their own successes. As Quinn Oler of Global News explains, there is a significant gap in the number of Indigenous students to serve their own communities. Yet, 90% of medical schools in the United States have 3 or fewer Indigenous students. So, we must create scholarships to supplement national efforts, like the Dr. Oz Diversity in Medicine Scholarship, a program that provides opportunities to qualified individuals from marginalized communities. Section 3, recruit. For young people of color to consider careers as medical professionals, they need to see people like them in those roles. Reallocate funding from discretionary grants, which are given to students through a competitive process for internships and fellowships for marginalized students. And Section 4, enrichment. Incorporate summer enrichment programs and initiatives, such as the proposed Expanding Medical Education Act of 2020, which helps institutions in predominantly marginalized communities grow medical training programs. And this creates a forward pipeline so that the youth of today become the change makers of tomorrow. So let's do it. To lift the voices of individuals of color, to increase trust in America's medical system, and to decrease health disparities across the board. because incremental progress like this has the ability to improve the health of communities that we've excluded for far too long. And as a woman of color, I consider myself lucky. And not for the Scooby-Doo Band-Aids, but because I have a doctor who truly understands my concerns. So the next time you go to get a flu shot, or maybe your COVID-19 vaccine, seeing a woman of your color as your doctor shouldn't be the exception, but hopefully the norm. So let's prescribe this change together. Thank you.
My reflection stared back at me, face full of colors deemed for adulthood. As the penetrating gaze met my eyes, I dared not look at the face of the man taking me away, snatching my innocence, my dreams, with an ending so abrupt. I asked my mother, when did I grow up? This poem captures the sentiments of Genevieve Meyer, who at 15 years old was coerced into a marriage with a 43-year-old man. Instead of staying up late, studying for the SAT, or attending slumber parties, Genevieve's teen years were wrought with caring for an abusive drunkard who preyed upon her vulnerability. And unfortunately, her experience is not an isolated one. As much as we prefer to think of child marriage as an issue exclusive to distant countries on faraway continents, the reality is far bleaker. Today alone, 40 children in the United States will have their childhoods ripped from their very fingers, forced into lifelong commitments before they are old enough to graduate high school, or in some cases, middle school. So today, let's examine the conditions which force hundreds of thousands of children like Genevieve into their situations by first understanding the pervasive nature of child marriage in our country, before next analyzing its widespread effects, and finally divorcing the issue to unearth a comprehensive legislative solution. Despite child marriage's persisting prevalence in the United States, media coverage and federal legislation have consistently failed to address its prominence. In reality, between 2000 and 2010, the Child Marriage Advocacy Group estimates that more than 260,000 children were married, 90% of whom were young girls married to adult men, as approximately 12% of American women today were married as minors. And because no federal law exists on child marriage, responsibility falls on state shoulders, whose backward stances permit these rates to continue and even grow. Currently, 25 states, including California, permit children of any age to be married, and even those which supposedly set the age floor at 18 permit a number of exceptions, such as parent or judge approval for a significantly younger child to be married. More devastating is that a key section of legislation permits marriage to serve as a valid defense against statutory rape, meaning that child predators are excused from any and all consequence if they subsequently marry the victim. Thus, our federal government not only condones child marriage, but actively provides sexual predators an incentive to force their victims to marry them. Sherry Johnson captures her own experience with this egregious provision, explaining, "When I was 9, I was raped, giving birth to my daughter at 10. And then when authorities investigated, instead of handcuffing him for what he did, they handcuffed me by putting me, an 11-year-old, in a wedding dress." Avoiding statutory rape charges is a major cause of child marriage, but the conditions leading up to this point are equally, if not more, ruinous. Growing up in households wrought with poverty as well as physical, emotional, and sexual abuse, marriage often seems like one of the only viable means of escape. For many child brides, persevering through home life and marrying a stranger are equally terrifying, essentially becoming a choice between the lesser of two evils. Genevieve Meyer describes how she remembers thinking, which horrifying door do I want to walk through? Do I want to stay here with my mother and her antics and who knows what's next? Or go marry this guy that at least doesn't beat me? But child marriage's detriments don't merely end at the altar. They permanently transform the trajectory of a child's life, denying them the right to health and any chance at prosperity. Despite the fact that an astounding 80% of marriages involving a child in the US end in divorce, laws prevent children from filing for divorce until they turn 18, effectively trapping them for years on end with no means of escape, trapping them in marriages where they are 3 times more likely to be abused by their partners. And even if divorce is achieved, child marriage followed by divorce doubles the likelihood of mothers descending into poverty. This, compounded by the fact that child brides are 50% more likely to drop out of high school and 4 times less likely to graduate from college, establishes an inescapable cycle of poverty, in which these mothers ultimately subject their children to the same conditions they experienced growing up. However, this is not the end of the story. Lack of opportunity represents only the tip of the iceberg. Because current laws protect child predators more than underage girls, pregnancy is often a motivating factor for these unions. However, bearing a child when one is not even fully developed themselves has severe consequences, which illustrates why complications in pregnancy and childbirth are the #1 cause of death for girls between 15 and 19, and why child brides suffer from significantly higher rates of postpartum depression and PTSD. The rampant causes and consequences of child marriage paint a dismal picture of the potential for change. And it's true. We can't undo the assault on human rights that has been experienced by millions. But that doesn't mean that we can't save future generations from being forced down the same path. And that is precisely why I propose the following 3-part legislation. First, we must tackle the root of the issue, thereby ensuring that no child experiences such dire circumstances of poverty and abuse that marriage seems to be a feasible option. Hence, I propose the reallocation of 2.3% of the welfare budget to fund the creation of a Partnership for Child Futures, a 2-way government partnership between the Committees on Child Welfare and Child Abuse and Neglect. Currently, there is a gross mismanagement in the distribution of federal assistance to children, as an absence of collaboration between these 2 committees has disabled millions of children from accessing either of their benefits. This partnership would prioritize distribution of resources from both committees, a necessary first step towards mitigating both child poverty and abuse. Second, needless to say, our most important step is to unconditionally outlaw child marriage, thereby ensuring there's no way to meander around unclear provisions. Thus, I propose that the national requirement for marriage be 18 years, without any exceptions being made for parent or judge approval, which would also effectively repeal the section enabling marriage to serve as a defense against statutory rape. Finally, we must wholeheartedly dedicate ourselves to serving as a light for the rest of the world. Outlawing the occurrence of child marriage in the United States is a massive step towards eliminating this practice in its entirety. But there are still over 12 million girls worldwide who will continue to be forced into marriage every single year. Currently, the US is one of only 3 nations to have not ratified the Convention on the Rights of a Child or to have committed to the UN Sustainable Development Goal to end child marriage by 2030. Hence, I propose that the United States solidify its stance on child marriage and sign on to both of these agreements, thereby helping to extinguish this practice once and for all. Already, there have been far too many lives disfigured by the practice of child marriage, lives that will inevitably continue to deteriorate. unless we pass this legislation today. Because if we can put an end to this dire human rights crisis, if we can provide concrete resources to confront the poverty and abuse our youth have been forced to endure, then there is hope for us yet. Legitimate means through which to fulfill our role as the true home of the free. It is finally time for us to ignite a period of positive international change and commit to children of the past, present, and future. Commit to the rediscovery of lost childhoods. Thank you.
After watching 6 seasons of Grey's Anatomy, I practically worship doctors. I mean, they're out here bringing people back from the brink of death, discovering unknown diseases. And golly, what I would have given to be under the care of Dr. Alexander Karev. Aside from Karev's not 5, not 6, but 8 packs of muscled stomach, he is also known for saying some incredibly questionable things. At first, I laughed. But after he straight up lied to a patient with amnesia for the 4th time in a row, I began to wonder, do some doctors seriously treat their patients this poorly? And unfortunately, the answer is actually yes. I mean, not with the outright flippancy used by Karev in his 8-pack, but because a large portion of hospital patients in the United States are often mistreated and misrepresented due to systemic racism stemming from racially skewed medical tools and algorithms. And this particularly affects Black kidney patients. In order to even be considered as a potential kidney recipient, hospitals must send the National Kidney Foundation, the NKF, the apparent glomerular filtration rate, which was also known as the GFR, a urine-based mathematical algorithm developed in the 1960s. In 1990, in order to account for muscle mass, 2 race factors were incorporated into the GFR algorithm, one for Black people, one for non-Black people. Yet in this day and age, because scientific research disproves any kind of correlation between muscle mass and ethnicity, many people view this addition of race factors into the GFR algorithm as a channel for racism. So today, let's explore this biased practice as I guide you through exactly why I don't like to go to the doctors. And first, we'll diagnose the detrimental effects of this racist practice on the health of Black kidney patients. Next, we'll examine how it has cultivated neglectful habits amongst healthcare workers. And finally, we'll introduce a cure to end this predicament, giving everyone a chance to live. First and foremost, the use of a race coefficient in the GFR algorithm causes Black patients to appear 15.9% healthier than patients of other racialized groups, even when they're not. And the effects of this, as illustrated by Paul Eggers of Medicare and Medicaid Services, shows that although Black people constitute over 35% of all kidney patients and are 4 times more likely to develop kidney disease, they are in fact 4 times less likely to receive a kidney transplant, even after all blood type, age, immunological, locational, and muscle mass factors have been excluded. In fact, earlier this year, Tom Simonite of Wired magazine reported that out of 57,000 kidney patients in Boston Hospital, 1/3 of Black patients would have been placed in critical care if their kidneys had been calculated with the same algorithm used for non-Black people. And unfortunately, it doesn't even stop there. Because in addition to postponing medical treatment, this racially skewed kidney algorithm also negatively affects the quality of hospital care Black kidney patients receive. This is because since neither a rational nor scientific answer can be provided to explain the addition of race coefficients into the GFR algorithm, a stereotype, one that is also supported by the NKF, has been developed. It claims that Black people are naturally healthier than white people. And despite this theory's lack of support by any kind of scientific research, the absence of change being made to establish equality in the GFR algorithm has led to a similar trend in the way healthcare workers respond to the needs of Black kidney patients. In 2017, The Agency for Healthcare Research and Quality reported that 40% of the quality measures were still worse for Blacks than whites. This stereotype that the kidney algorithm is based on only encourages biases already held amongst numerous healthcare workers and causes doctors to be less attentive towards the needs of Black kidney patients because they now view them as healthy. They are less likely to notice pain or discomfort on the faces of Black kidney patients, and even if they do, they are much less likely to respond to it. And this growing trend in the treatment of Black kidney patients also extends the kind of medical equipment hospitals and the NKF are willing to even provide them with. According to the Henry Ford Health System, 80% of Black patients who do receive a kidney receive cadaver kidneys, which are kidneys from deceased humans. They are only successful 75% of the time, compared to kidneys from living donors, which are successful 95% of the time. Cadaver kidneys last a decade at most, compared to kidneys from living donors, which generally last a lifetime. Yet this is actually one of the most repulsive parts of this disparity, because even when Black people finally do receive a kidney, even it is of lower quality and much less likely to even work. It is important for us to remember that behind these shocking and disturbing statistics are real people. People like Moshe Tati, who suffered a heart attack within hours of a surgeon transplanting a poisoned, unregistered cadaver kidney into his body. People like 16-year-old Regina Scott, who is not even considered as a potential kidney recipient until she had lost her eyesight as a result of kidney failure, all because of a racially skewed higher GFR score. And people like the over 800 Black kidney patients in Boston Hospital who have not received the care they need because of the color of their skin. They are people. Yet some of us seem to forget that. The negligence and brazen indifference towards the health of Black kidney patients places thousands at risk each and every day. And it all points back to the incorporation of race factors in the GFR algorithm. And there's no one way to bring an end to this horrific disparity. A disparity that is rooted into the very foundations of this country, and therefore a disparity that most people do not even know about. So in order to end it, we must start small, but most importantly, we must start somewhere. Consequently, I've come up with a 3-part plan. Part 1, elimination. The practice of integrating any and all race factors in the GFR algorithm should be deemed illegal in all medical institutions throughout the United States. This practice achieves nothing except prioritizing the care of non-Black people by steeply worsening the condition of Black kidney patients. Secondly, we need to reform patient care. Programs should be implemented as a part of basic training to ensure that healthcare workers are educated on how to speak to and respect patients of different ethnic backgrounds. Seminars teaching healthcare workers how to identify and set aside prejudices should also be included. Because by learning how to respect different cultures, people will be less likely to condemn them. Which brings us to part 3. Prevent the resurgence of racist medical practices. Hospitals should provide patient care evaluations to be completed by patients upon each visit. Additionally, a department or board of equity should be provided to healthcare workers to report on colleagues who they believe are violating hospital or state guidelines for patient care. These reports and evaluations should be reviewed frequently by the hospital and at least semi-annually by state officials. As a society, it is our job to value each other's lives, all lives. Yet we fail in doing so when permitting the blatant disregard of Black lives by tolerating this racially skewed kidney algorithm. It is past time that we start holding our government and medical officials accountable by calling for these kinds of changes to policies that violate our natural rights. As a society, this is our problem and this is our fight. So let us start fighting. Let us fight for a world where we do not have to fear the color of our skin becoming a barrier in addition to the medical challenges we are already facing. Let us fight for a world where we feel safe going to the doctors. Let us fight for a world where we are equals. Let us fight for Black lives. Let us start fighting. Here and now. Thank you.
During quarantine, a lot of us have taken up cooking. In fact, it's weird if you haven't baked banana bread yet. There's a reason why quarantine 15 has become a thing. With nothing much else to do, we've been eating, stocking up on the basics. Eggs, meat, fruit and veggies, chips, too many chips, and pastries for our coffee. But what you may not realize is that your shelves and pantries are likely filled with products picked, packed, and prepared by children. So today, let's take a closer look at what goes into our food supply chain. Ingredients such as immigrant child labor, exploitation, and dangerous working conditions. Then I will propose a recipe to remedy this situation that should have been illegal from the start. Because to borrow from songwriter Waddy Guthrie, in our pastures of plenty, no child should work till they die. Now, as someone who loves studying history and deeply admires all of the progressive changes this country has made over the years, I was recently shocked to learn that oppressive child labor in the United States did not end when Congress passed the Fair Labor Standards Act of 1938. I learned about that law in conjunction with reading the famous novel The Jungle, which is required reading at my high school. The Jungle exposed how the Chicago meatpacking industry exploited European immigrant workers at the turn of the century, many of them children. That book also made me a vegetarian. But more importantly, The Jungle influenced our government to pass needed reforms. But like so many shameful episodes in our past, rather than learn from them, we seem doomed to repeat our mistakes. Chicago is still the meatpacking center of our nation, but the immigrant children working there are now more likely to be Guatemalan teenagers. They spend their nights doing dangerous work in order to pay off debts to smugglers, to contribute to rent, to buy groceries, and to send money back to the family members they left behind in Central America. The working conditions are dangerous. The graveyard shifts long, and these underage employees are supposed to be in school the next day. No wonder they nod off in their classes, don't complete assignments, receive failing grades, and ultimately drop out. So the cycle of poverty continues through the exploitation of immigrant Latino youth as they are forced to sacrifice their education. I am a Guatemalan immigrant myself. My parents moved here to give me a chance at the American dream without having to make the same sacrifices that they made, dropping out of school at the tender ages of 11 to work in the fields. Ironically, the same problem that they immigrated to escape is occurring right here in this country. This country, which is supposed to be the land of limitless opportunity. In recent years, thousands of Central American children and families have fled their impoverished homelands, hoping for asylum in the United States. Of those coming from Guatemala, 80% were families or children traveling alone. ProPublica has published several articles exposing the prevalence of immigrant teens working dangerous factory jobs. One such teen, 15-year-old Garcia, left his family behind in Guatemala in order to help them financially and to further his education. Once here, he moved in with an aunt and uncle. And within a week, his relatives had him signed up with an oficina, the term that Spanish-speaking immigrants used to describe the staffing agencies that employers use to hire cheap labor. By using an agency, employers reduce their legal exposure if the workers supplied lack appropriate documentation or are underage. Garcia's first job was at an auto parts factory. From 6 p.m. to 6 a.m., he cleaned newly made screws and bolts with an air gun. He wore safety goggles to shield his eyes from the shards of metal that would often blow in his face. Garcia told journalist Melissa Sanchez that he wanted to go to college to study architecture. "I've always liked to draw," he told her, "and I'm good at math." At the beginning of 2020, Garcia left the punishing factory job to work at a restaurant so he would have more time to sleep and study. But the pandemic closed the restaurant in March. At the same time, his high school shifted to remote learning and shorter school days. Garcia couldn't take advantage of the extra time to study. He needed money. He returned to the overnight shift at the factory. School became a distant concern. As we see over and over, child labor interferes with schooling and locks these children into low-wage jobs, trapping them in a cycle of poverty that is likely to last generations. As bad as it is for child factory workers, it is even worse for children working in the fields. Child labor laws for agriculture are much more lenient than those regulating any other occupation. That Fair Labor Standards Act I mentioned at the beginning of my speech has thrown a few loopholes over the years. For example, it is legal for agribusiness to hire children as young as 12 to work for unlimited hours outside of school with parental consent. On smaller farms, there is even less protection. No minimum age at all. One of the worst offenders is, no surprise, the tobacco industry. Here's a fun fact. Although kids under 18 are legally prohibited from buying tobacco products in all 50 states, those same kids can legally harvest tobacco plants. Working with tobacco leaves can cause acute nicotine poisoning, marked with nausea, vomiting, headaches, and dizziness. Some of the pesticides commonly used are neurotoxins, chemicals that can destroy nerve tissue. These toxins pose special dangers to children with developing brains and bodies, yet 12-year-olds can work 50 to 60 hours a week on a US tobacco farm, and it's legal. The organization Human Rights Watch has been sounding the alarm on tobacco farming for years. Beyond exposure to toxins, the work itself is dangerous. In one case, pressure by a tobacco grower to work faster caused 17-year-old Isaac to lose 2 of his fingers in an accident involving a mower. He said, "My hand got stuck, and I cut off 2 of my fingers. It went really fast, and I couldn't stop it." Reid Malky of the National Consumers League says that these mostly Latino child farm workers drop out at 4 times the national rate. As if that were bad enough, Human Rights Watch reports that more US child workers die in agriculture than in any other industry. In the latest year for which there are reliable statistics, 2012, 2/3 of children who died from occupational injuries were farm workers. Additionally, more than 1,800 non-fatal injuries were reported that same year. More recent statistics do not exist because under the status quo, the US Labor Department is not required to collect them. Why must we rely on children to harvest produce in America? The child labor exemptions in US law essentially allow legal exploitation. Isn't it time to protect all of our children equally? That's why I call on Congress to pass the CARE Act, introduced for the first time by Congresswoman Lucille Roy Balagart 20 years ago. Congress has yet to take action. Ms. Ayart has reintroduced it several times since, most recently in June 2019. Tragically, it sits in the House Committee on Education and Labor, apparently collecting dust. I have taken the liberty to make a few changes. Therefore, I advocate that Congress immediately pass my version of the CARE Act. CARE Act is an acronym for Children's Act for Responsible Employment. Section 1. The Fair Labor Standards Act of 1938 will be amended as follows. Section 2. Agricultural exemptions for the employment of children shall be repealed and replaced with age and work hour standards matching juvenile employment and other industries. In all cases, farm work employment of children under the age of 14 is prohibited. Section 3. Employers will be prohibited from using staffing agencies to supply them with juvenile workers. Instead, any child aged 14 to 16 must be hired directly by the employer, and that employer shall be subject to criminal fines and penalties if they are found to be in violation of this act. Section 4. The U.S. Labor Department will submit to Congress an annual report on work-related deaths, injuries, and illnesses of children working in agriculture. I know we love paying bargain prices for our supermarket bounties of fruits and vegetables, but those cheap prices come at the expense of tiny battered bodies and stolen dreams. Norma Lopez, chair of the Domestic Issues Committee for the Child Labor Coalition, says, today in America, there are as many as 500,000 children performing back-breaking and often dangerous work with few protections and for very low wages. They are sacrificing their childhoods to put food on their families' tables and on our tables. If the cost of labor goes up and that translates to higher prices, so be it. We've shown we're willing to pay more for grass-fed beef, free-range chicken, and organic produce. This is a small price to pay to extend protections to all of America's children. It is high time to pass the CARE Act. Thank you.